Guys, this is going to be a really bizarre supplementals episode. I'm sorry. We have five books in two categories. Kind of, it's weird. We're just gonna make it work. It's fine. So in my last episode, I did a whole bunch of books on the Republican Party to go along with other books on the Republican Party I had already read and talked about. And I said, well, I've also done some on some Democrats and the Democratic Party, but that just not gonna fit in this video. And I did mean what I said, and the thing is that proportionally right now, there's just way more books on the Republican/conservative movement than there is on the Democrats, but I'm gonna give you two that I've read, and then we're gonna move into some straight on shenanigans. But to start with, one of the books that I read was called This Will Not Pass: Trump, Biden, and the Battle for American Democracy. Now, you can kind of get the sense from the title what is going on here and the general gist of the book. And in some ways, I wonder if the title gives it a bad rap. It kind of doesn't suggest to you what you're going to get. I know when I first saw that title, I thought it was going to be like a Biden victory book in some ways. And I mean, it kind of is. But what it really is a look at the first 2 years of the Biden presidency and a critical look at that. And I feel like so many books have been coming out and are out there about, Trump and the effect of his presidency, but they stop when he leaves office, or they stop with January 6th, and then they're just done. And rather than treating all of that as the big thing, this book is okay, all of that has a ripple effect. The pandemic didn't just stop. All of these conversations didn't just stop. And now we have an expressly contentious, particularly the House and the Senate, different factions fighting each other. And all of that is playing out in Biden's term. And this book is, I guess you could say, pro-Democrat in the sense that, the author is very much on the train of Trump lost presidency, Joe Biden won, the election was not stolen, etc. But is also just very keen to say the Democrats had an opportunity here and they squandered it, or this wasn't done as well as it could have been, and maybe let's talk about why. Or why is there so much Democratic infighting when they have the House and the Senate? So it was just really nice to read something that moved beyond a lot of the other stuff that I was reading and helped maybe to explain what has happened in the first 2 years of Biden's presidency and what was happening behind the scenes, and some of these bigger bills and the initiatives that they've tried to do and why they haven't worked in some cases. Also, it was compulsively readable. This was definitely a nonfiction book that probably could have gotten really out of hand. There's a lot of players, there's a lot of moving parts, you have to know a lot of names. And maybe part of it was that because it is contemporary history, I know a lot of the names, but I think the writing style to this one as well, you just kept reading. And a lot of nonfiction, it's not written in sometimes a very smooth style, but this was very well written and I enjoyed it. I can't say that it was my favorite thing ever, but I enjoyed the change of pace, and I enjoyed, a little bit more focus on the Democratic Party and what is happening there. The other book, despite the title, is not neutral at all. And so this was Chaotic Neutral: How the Democrats Lost Their Soul in the Center by Ed Burmilla. This book is hilarious. It is the saltiest, sassiest thing, while also being a history of the Democratic Party, and then just throwing up your hands and being what is wrong with you people, from the view of someone who is left but just doesn't understand why the party is acting the way it is, why it can't get certain things done, And I think there's been a lot of discussion of, you know, the Democrats positioning themselves so often as just, we're not the Republicans, and therefore, like, you have to vote for us. And Bermilla basically saying, like, that will get you only so far, and like, you actually have to do things to be an active party. You have a really, really broad coalition. I understand there's a lot of infighting, but like, come on, guys, like, let's do, like, there were so many times during, and even the footnotes, this is one of these audiobooks where they read the footnotes to you in the audiobook, and that does not always work for me. But even just his footnotes, like, I'm laughing out loud or just snorting, because I'm just like, he's not holding back just how he feels on Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment, the way they're choosing to run things, the way that things have been run, the sticks. He was just really funny. And I think as someone who, you know, votes Democratic, but, you know, would also like to see something a little bit better than what we're getting, it's a really, really interesting book, and talking about a lot of these things that I'm frustrated with and maybe don't know why I'm frustrated. And he kind of lays out arguments for those points, which was really great. Plus, there's this really excellent last chapter where he talks about how all of nonfiction has a last chapter problem, where you spent like 300 to 500 or pages or more explaining a problem, and then you're supposed to like wrap it up or give solutions in the last chapter. And he's like, this is ridiculous, it's impossible, and nobody should do this. And so just as a reader of nonfiction with that last chapter, I was just like laughing. I really love this book. I think that it's incredibly poignant. Don't take how funny it is as like not important, because it is. And I think it asks a lot of questions that the Democratic Party really needs to ask itself. But as a reader and a listener, I was just like, this is great. I love it. Hysterical. Just tear them apart. Okay. The next 3 books that we're going to talk about are kind of sort of a sequence that I went through. And there are really serious reasons and frustrations and a little bit of even anger within this, but I do have to say that if you're gonna hang out, we will be mentioning instances of sexual assault. So if those are not things that you want to hear about, even in like a historical context, I offer you the first 2 books that I talked about, and you can go along your way. Thank you for hanging out with me this long. The books in question that I'm going to be talking about are 1, Sex with Presidents, The Ins and Outs of Love and Lust in the White House by Eleanor Herman. 2, Once Upon a Secret, My Affair with President JFK, John F. Kennedy, and Its Aftermath by Mimi Alford. And 3, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy by Annette Gordon Reed. Most of the discussion of sexual assault will be with the first 2 books. The third one is slightly more historical, but it goes to the larger conversation. So again, if you those are the books. If you don't want to hear about this, you can head out. Otherwise, I'm gonna get mad. So I read Sex with Presidents as like a book where I thought I just need like a breather. I've been reading a lot of these really heavy political science books, and this book seems really interesting, and the back of the book has a lot of really strong feminist wording, like, you know, thought it would be like a very feminist take on some more salacious history and not, you know, death and dying of the Republic situation. So it opens up, and one of the first things that it talks about is the Reynolds affair from Hamilton. So if you've seen the musical, sing the song, but it was one of the first sex scandals in American history, and talking about, you know, the way that it's dealt with. And then the end of the book, it will talk about Me Too. And so it's basically trying to like run this gamut of how these sex stories have been talked about in the press, how they've affected politics and that. And you're like, okay, I understand your argument. So one of the next things that it brings up is Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting, I would not necessarily consider this like a fun, salacious sex story. There's a lot of baggage wrapped up in this, but all right, if you're also trying to say there's a darker side to some of these stories, or, you know, more serious side to some of these stories, okay, all right, I'll go on this journey with you, I guess. And then it just got worse. And putting on an equivalency in the end of presidents who had affairs in the White House and presidents who may or may not have committed sexual assault. And so, for example, you get this story, you know, like you get Warren Harding and the love letters that he wrote his mistresses. One in particular, these letters are crazy. And you're like, I cannot believe anyone ever wrote that. And I'm so sorry that we have those. And he was cheating on his wife. And that is not good. I am not here saying affairs are like good or decent things to happen. However, when a chapter like that is then put next to how Grover Cleveland was accused of rape, those two things are not equivalent. And I also just didn't like how consistently across the chapters, whether or not the president in question was having consensual sex or not, talking about just constantly describing the wives as dowdy, and like that's why these people were seeking sexual partners elsewhere. That felt really uncomfortable. All of the women were predominantly just described as their physical appearance and very little else. There was also really, really weird things going on with the sourcing. For most of these chapters, Eleanor Herman's only quoting like one source, and it's typically a source that either came from like a newspaper or like the woman's diaries, or like something like Nan Britton, who was one of Warren Harding's lovers, like her book that came out after the fact, and just not saying, you know, this is the account of Nan Britton, but saying this is what happened. And I'm not saying, you know, to not believe women, but I am saying that this is a history book and you need to present multiple sources. The Grover Cleveland one especially really threw me. I've read multiple books on Grover Cleveland for some reason, and the way that that was presented struck me as really odd. So yeah, I finished that book and I felt deeply uncomfortable. I felt deeply uncomfortable for the women who were depicted, all of them, in that book. I felt really, really frustrated by the ahistorical or just questionable sourcing that happened. And yeah, I just really, you know, I did not feel like equating. In the end, the final argument still doesn't make a distinction on how affairs are different than non-consensual sex. And that felt really, really weird to me, and I do not recommend that book at all unless you want to experience that for yourself. But one of the things that I could check for myself as a reader who was questioning how sourcing happened in Sex with Presidents was that I could go to one of the sources, read the source, and then see if that source was accurately portrayed in the book. And that's how I get to Once Upon a Secret. Mimi Alford is one of the people featured in the chapter on JFK that appears in Sex with Presidents. And in Sex with Presidents, Mimi Alford has a 2-year affair with JFK, but Eleanor Herman presents Mimi's initial sexual encounter with JFK as non-consensual. So I went to the source and I read Once Upon a Secret, and I'll talk about the book itself a little bit and just say that this book is so honestly written. And like one of the things that really was surprising to me was that, you know, JFK dies, the affair ends, and there's still a third of the book left. Not that it's a long book, but there's a lot that happens after that in the aftermath, kind of as to the subtitle of the book, and it's just so honest and open. And that was the part of the book, honestly, that I found the most engaging, because Mimi Alford is just really giving us a very personal look at her life and how she came to reckon with the choices that she made, you know, because she initially came to the White House like to interview the first lady. So she knows that she's having an affair with a married man. She, to a certain extent, knows the wife. And, you know, she does this for 2 years. She's 19 when it starts. And that part of the book alone is incredible. And I don't want that to get lost in anything else that I do say. And, you know, throughout the book too, she's just very like, you know, I was 19 and I did it for this reason, and I can recognize now that it was wrong, but like, here's what I was thinking in the meantime. But then also giving herself grace. Like, I was 19 and I got swept up in this, and like, you know, I made bad choices, but this was a thing that totally changed my life for very, very bad, and for in some ways good as well. So while we as outside people can have opinions on Mimi and JFK's relationship, I think what matters in the end is how Mimi herself sees it. And so while my immediate reaction to reading the book is she was manipulated, there was a power imbalance, JFK used that to continue to like ensnare her in this 2-year-long thing that, you know, really begins to negatively affect her, and she's not really liking it. But you know that there's a power imbalance, and that all that kind of stuff is happening. And regarding their first sexual encounter, it definitely makes me uncomfortable, even the way that Mimi Alford writes it, because she's a virgin at the time. She does not know what is happening. He does not ask for consent. He kind of asks, like, are you okay? And she's like, but at that point things are already happening, and she doesn't feel comfortable in that situation saying no. Very different time also. And he's the president of the United States. We, again, as outside people, can have opinions on that. But Mimi Alford herself never says, I was sexually assaulted. She never says, I felt like I was being manipulated. She does not call it sexual assault. And in the end, you know, thinks that because of what happened, she was able to really become the best version of herself after she deals with it all. In Sex with Presidents, Eleanor Herman unequivocally calls it sexual assault, and basically using some of the language from Once Upon a Secret to prove her point, when that's not what Mimi herself is writing. And again, I haven't read every book that is quoted in Sex with Presidents, but this was kind of like my, yeah, this is not great. It's really not providing, even, again, if we're trying to use women's voices and promote women's voices and their truth, their version of their truth, Herman doesn't do that in Sex with Presidents. She completely misrepresents what Mimi herself thinks of the situation to prove what she thinks of the situation. And again, in the era of Me Too, would we call that sexual assault? Yes, we would. But it's not how Mimi sees it. And that just seemed like a poor choice for the author as well. So the Annette Gordon Reed book that I read, I didn't really read it in reaction to Sex with Presidents. I just kind of read it because I was thinking about it because of Sex with Presidents, but the audiobook had just been re-released. So Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, is actually an old book. It's from the 90s, and this was before we had DNA evidence that proved that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson had children together. And prior to that, even though there was all this evidence that said that they had children together, people were making up all of these excuses and who was the, you know, real father of Sally's children, and this is just salacious gossip and blah, blah, blah. And so this book by Annette Gordon Reed is the investigation, basically to prove, even without DNA evidence, that it is wild to draw any other conclusion other than these were the children of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and they did have a multi-decade long relationship. Annette Gordon Reed does not necessarily say what she thinks of it. Her point is it happened, and Sally Hemings was important to Thomas Jefferson in some sense or fashion, and they had children together, which he did treat better than the other enslaved people on Monticello. And basically saying, don't make Sally or what she was doing, did do, and her children less than what they are. This book is shorter than the other work that I've read by her, The Hemmingses of Monticello, and that one I was like, I don't understand her writing style. It's like going down every avenue and exploring everything and saying, if not this, then this, and this is why this can't possibly be what happened because blah, blah. And I was like, yo, there is so much in this book. And now that I've read this, because this came before The Hemmingses of Monticello, I totally understand that writing style more, because that's the point of this book, right? Is to say, okay, these are the theories that have been presented, and now we're going to explore each and every one and kind of figure out why it is or isn't possible. And in order to prove my point, I have to get rid of every other like possible scenario and prove logically through evidence why it's not possible in order to make my point. And it is wild how incredibly accurate Annette Gordon-Reed is in this book without having the DNA evidence to prove her case. And it's an incredible book. It's an incredible historical moment for the Thomas Jefferson and historical legacy debate. I'm really glad that I read it, because I feel like also like Annette Gordon-Reed's entire practice in her writing makes way more sense to me, and she's one of the preeminent scholars in this corner of the field, and so it's really important to read her work as well. All right, that was a lot for one video. I'm really sorry. There were a lot of things happening here. If you want to read books on the Democratic Party, I do recommend the first two. If you want to read something about sex in the White House, please don't read Sex with Presidents. That was not great. If you want to hear about sex with presidents, I guess go to the women who wrote their own stories. Read them in their own words, at the very least. And if you want to see incredible historical investigative work, you can read Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. I am nearly caught up on my backlog, and I cannot wait to be reading books on pirates and Vikings. Have a great one, guys. Bye.